I'm going to invite Sharon Jagger to come up now. Dr. Sharon Jagger is Senior Lecturer of Religion at York St John.
Thanks very much, and absolutely delighted to be part of the lineup as well. My entire academic career is hinged on, that sounds really bad, doesn't it? It's hinged on the experiences of women clergy, so I apologise for that. I've got the giddy heights of senior lectureship by studying the awful situation that women clergy find themselves in. So I want to talk, I'm plugging another book actually, so do ask me about that later. But I'm actually here to talk about a piece of work that myself and Becky Tyndall, who's studying at Durham University, it's just hot off the digital press. Some of you may have seen it, some of you may not be aware of it yet, but hopefully you'll all be absolutely desperate to read it in the next 20 minutes. I do need to give all the credit for the title to Martine, which grieves me greatly because it's such a brilliant title. I really desperately wish I'd thought of it first, but no, it wasn't to be. Thank you very much. Much better title, Rock the Boat. And this is, it's very well included in the order of our conversations here, because given what Mark has just said about the complications and as rich a history and interesting discussions that is, imagine if you are just popping along to your local church and you are not a specialist in any of this, and you're a woman who thinks the church ordains women, so it must be all right if I do a thing here. And then after some years, find yourself in a church that actually limits women's roles and women's ministries. You can completely understand how that might happen. So transparency about church positions is something to be temporarily ameliorated. I need to emphasize that. This piece of work is absolutely not about making it a bit better so that everything's okay in the end. It dovetails with the work that Watch are now reinvigorating about, can we now revisit this and look at dismantling what feels very permanent. So I don't want this piece of work to be taken as though it is about amelioration and making it better for people. It absolutely isn't. And I think what I'm hopefully so much rich information, I'm not going to get everything in the next 20 minutes, but hopefully it'll give you a flavour of the damage non-transparency around gendered theology positions actually does to people. Mainly women, because they're the ones whose subjectivity is being questioned, but women and their allies find it incredibly damaging. So that's me. I'll move on to the next slide. I'm completely out of order here. So a big thank you to Becky, who did a great deal of work on this, and I feel a bit cheeky standing here and delivering this. So I really need Becky to be included, to Martine. And Watch, for full transparency in myself, Watch has funded this project, which was absolutely fantastic. And it's not a closed project either, so at the end I'm going to hopefully encourage you to send the message out if anybody else wants to share their story. We're absolutely all ears for that. And obviously a huge thanks to the people who will remain anonymous, but they shared some very deep and emotional stories, and I'm hopefully going to be able to give you a flavour of that as I talk through. So I also want to just mention something. I'm going to mention two things and not unpack them at all. And see if it affects anybody's conversations. Sometimes we end up talking in binaries, and I come from an academic position where gender binary is really something to be critiqued and dissolved, really. I work with an awful lot of non-binary and trans students. I did a piece of work at York St John looking at how trans and non-binary people engage with Christian chaplains. You know, does the church kind of have a place for them? And there's all that talk about safe churches, safe places for non-binary, which is a different thing to sexuality, in case you're not up with the acronyms. So it's really just to put that out there, that we're talking in binaries, and actually we need to probably change our paradigm a little bit. Having said that, thank you. Having said that, our cohort, we did have a non-binary person volunteer their story, but our cohort does float around this sort of binary perception. So I did need to underline that we perhaps need more depth in our conversations and to expand the way we talk about gender. And next slide, thank you. I also just want to say why transparency might be so important to study. It's a safeguarding issue. It's extremely harmful, as I've already said. It also damages the church's reputation. And so the seniority of the church should be really worried about that. There are hidden churches, not hidden churches, but their positions are hidden. And it just is a really bad reputational thing to happen when people experience a kind of leaking out of, oh my goodness, this church doesn't affirm women's ministry in the way I thought it did and should. So it's a reputational thing which is part of the argument. It's also, more importantly, an issue about ethics. It's not ethical to not be transparent about a gendered issue of this nature. So when somebody turns up to a church, ethically, they should be able to give their full, knowledgeable consent about what they are participating in. So it is as basic a thing as that, and it's social justice as well. I'm cards on the table, I'm a feminist researcher, so this does exercise me quite a lot, really, that as a woman, I want to be able to go to somewhere and absolutely understand the context that I'm putting myself into. And also, it's an egregious example of symbolic violence against women, I won't unpack the whole thing about symbolic violence, but it means it goes under the radar and it's hidden, and sometimes we end up colluding with it. We end up colluding with theologies because they are called theologies, and we are not allowed to say that that's actually harmful to my subjectivity because somebody has put the label of theology on it. So I'm speaking with my academic hat, and I'm just putting the finishing touches to a book that really unpacks that, about these hidden transcripts, how people resist, how women clergy actually resist some of these things that are misrecognised and hidden. So I'll just throw that out there as well, that when you say the word theology, that has all sorts of connotations about symbolic violence, and that might be a bit controversial. I hope so. And let's face it, we're talking about power over women, that's the bottom line, so I'm not very happy about that anyway. So the clues for me getting involved in this theme is that I also experienced, as a young woman, I experienced this, and it left me really, really damaged in lots of different ways. It certainly damaged the way I see faith and the church. But you can ask me about that over a cup of tea and a biscuit. And also, when I did my PhD research with women clergy, it came up. One woman said that she literally had no idea this was a thing. She ended up a few years worshipping in a church, felt she was called to the priesthood, went through the discernment process. When it came to getting her reference from her sponsoring vicar, he absolutely trashed the idea of her, and he was a member of Forward in Faith. She'd never even heard of Forward in Faith. It took her 7 years to go around that cycle. She had to move churches, and somebody said, "Didn't the DDO warn you about that?" No. So there's that sort of culture of quietness and silence, and I'll hopefully have time just to touch on that again. Okay, next slide. So more details about the project. Sorry, I was just going to say that this dovetails with what Watch's strategy actually is. So it underpins the whole idea of actually the structure is harmful in itself. It's just even more harmful if you don't know what you're getting yourselves into. So that's just to underline that, and I went out of order. Thanks. So on the next slide, there's the project itself. So it's 3 parts. I'm hoping to whet your appetite, so I won't do too much detail. It's all there in the document. We firstly did a very comprehensive survey of all the web presences of churches listed either under the umbrella of the Society, St Hilda and St Wilfrid and St Hilda, or had alternative episcopal oversight. And that second list is not necessarily very public. We had to kind of ask for that. So there's an issue there. And we looked at how they showed publicly their positioning. And if you don't know what the society is, you are never in a million years going to understand the implications of that. So that was one of our findings. There were some examples of better ways of messaging, but the majority really relied on knowledge that most of you here will have, but you know, a lot of people absolutely have no idea what being a Forward in Faith member is or anything like that. So it's coded language. And just to briefly say that conservative evangelical churches have a different way of expressing it, and there's a suggested wording from Bishop of Maidstone, I think, put that together. And even that, you know, could be made more explicit. I mean, using the word woman would help, you know. But seriously, many don't even use the word woman, and we've highlighted that in the report. But the other thing that is, again, about symbolic violence is the way the word equal is used in the materials, equal but different. And when I was like 12, I found that utterly ridiculous and offensive as a young teenager with no kind of framework. So, you know, we are able to really point that out. If somebody walks into a church, sees the word equal but different, it needs to be absolutely unpacked. What do you actually mean by that? Because the word equal is being misappropriated. And I think that's very in keeping with what we're talking about. And then the second part was a survey. This is actually the most difficult part of the research, was reaching people who had had experiences of being in a church where they didn't know what context they were in. For obvious reasons, some have kind of left church or moved on or didn't really know that you were allowed to talk about it. So we found numbers very small and modest, so it's not really a statistical exercise, but what it did do was draw out ways in which people were felt harmed by it and ways in which people gradually discovered where the context that they were in. So they're very interesting stories. Sometimes it was just realizing that your child was being taught about male headship in Sunday school, you know, after a few years, and that obviously without your consent is very problematic. And then the third one, which I think is the richest, and people do listen to people's stories. So we interviewed 15 people who generously gave us their experiences, and we've documented as much as we could in the report. And some of them are very emotional. There's a lot of damage being talked about, very traumatized people, as I was with my experiences. So I think that is the main message is it's incredibly important to hear people's stories, but with the caveat being these are not individualized problems. I'm a sociologist, so I set everything into the structural context. It's about systemic failure to be ethical and upfront. So although individuals have their individual stories and traumas, actually, and I think I'm preaching to the choir, aren't I? It is about structural, systemic issue. Okay, thanks. Do let me know when I need to shut up. So really briefly, the findings. Coded language I've already talked about. And in the survey, there was, we ended up looking at 42 individual responses. And so there was this gradual realization about the church positions. So I'll move on. I've already talked about that. And then just to look at the themes that came out of the interviews. So we labelled this the impact of not knowing, just to really underline the idea of that it's about transparency. How people choose a church and you rock up and there's no information, or it's coded information. We talked about silencing strategies. There's a really good book by Sarah Ahmed called Complaint, and she focuses on higher educational institutions and about how institutions divert complaints or make complaining so difficult that people don't do it, or obfuscate, or blame the complainant and make it their fault. All those things came up in our research. So one woman told us that she was made to feel like the strange one she went as far as the bishop, but it felt like she was the one that was in the wrong somehow. So there's a kind of shame discourse around that if you decide to say something. So there are all these strategies, and it's not always conscious, but sometimes it is a way of not dealing with the issue. The language practice and the limiting of women, so stories about how language obfuscates what's actually going on. Gender roles, so that's about complementarianism, and this was a big thing. We looked at those churches that put the hand up and say we kind of have this thing, but we're not going to tell you all about it. There are lots of hidden contexts. So if you go to a church that doesn't have a resolution, for example, but has a very strong leaning towards complementarianism, and you don't know what that is a hidden thing. So that's a major issue that we couldn't tackle in this project, because that would be a big piece of work, trying to kind of look at that separately, trying to find how that affects people. There's no way of identifying clearly where those churches are. So it's really about deconstructing what complementarianism means and the kind of continuum of that. And people who are not specialists in theology, they don't have time, they're not really necessarily wanting to tackle it at that level. So, you know, we have to be really aware of the damage some of that context does. And there has been a report, hasn't there, looking at how that culture kind of is not good always. For me, for my money, the bits to read are the impact on faith and families and individual psyches, if you like. Those are really deep stories and talk about damage to faith, where people think, I'm just now really adrift because of what's happening to me, because of my gender. And also the damage it does to other relationships that people have. So we did include, it's a very short concluding paragraph about resistances as well. So it's not as straightforward as saying, so just leave the church when you find out. And this came across quite strongly in some of the stories, that people have built up their community life, their friendships. They actually really like the vicar. They've got strong connections. Their children go to the local school, whatever it is. So it's not as simple as saying when you find out, then, pick up your faith and go somewhere else. So some people stay. So really it's maybe there's a piece of work to be done about how people can resist where they are and help maybe raise consciousness about those messages and what's happening. So really that's, I was going to share some quotes, but I'm actually going to leave you to read through the report. Hopefully it's a really accessible report, and it looks long, but the word's quite big. The font's big, so, and there are some nice graphs in there. And then, most importantly, there are a set of recommendations that obviously talk about the messaging aspect pragmatically, but also holding churches to account. So there's a job there for the church hierarchy to say this is not acceptable. You absolutely have to at least put the word woman on your website and make it really super clear where you stand. Individual churches, obviously, understanding that it's harmful, and really, really quickly we came across the reasons why transparency has become a thing is because sometimes people don't want to talk about it because it's a bit, they want it to be a harmonious environment. They also infantilise congregations, so they don't want to put politics on congregations. So women particularly are scrabbling around trying to find information, you know, and want that information. So those kind of barriers where if we can sort of say it's okay to have those conversations, you're not going to cause a riot, that's fine. Obviously, some people absolutely do not want to say very plainly what they think about gender. And that's another question altogether. So we've sort of posed those questions as part of our recommendations. Another pragmatic one is around resolutions and consultation. So that should be frequent, wide, and not secret, and people should know what a resolution is and who's voting for it and all that. And who knows, maybe far fewer, I think there's 500 churches, maybe far fewer would actually end up with a resolution if it was done in an ethical way. So I'll stop there and just commend you to the report, really, and I hope you get a chance to read it. And I'm leaving it open. So my last slide has got my email address on. Do contact me, and let's chat. And if you've got stories, we're still collecting the stories. Thank you.
Thank you. This is one I can't resist reading. It's hard to get my PCT degree on which coffee to serve. How can we expect a church to make a choice about whether or not to support the ordination of women? Well,
if you're asking me, I would say there isn't a choice, but I wouldn't even give them the choice to have a vote. The vote is just a weird thing in my world. But raising consciousness is a big thing, and realising the ways people are being silenced is very important. So if you find yourself unable to have those conversations with a PCC, there's something wrong, pretty wrong there, I think. Am I allowed to say that?
Yeah, really important question here. Where can we get hold of the book, Rock the Boat, electronically?
Good
Is there a
question.
link? How do we get hold of it?
Yeah, we need to talk about that, don't we?
On the Watch website.
Is it? Yeah,
very
Watch
soon.
website.
I don't think it is at the moment, but it will be soon.
We'll find a home for it. If you want it ASAP, just email me and I'll send you the PDF.
Okay, is there any awareness of how many church schools are linked to churches under alternative oversight? Schools do promote equality, so potentially have welcome clergy to speak to children who have very sexist views. Is the DfE aware of this, and how might Watch explore this avenue of transparency? Yeah, it does remind me also, another thing is how many of our children, daughters are confirmed by bishops who don't ordain women and are not told that in advance. And I'm often called out when I mention this, because, oh, please don't say that, you're upsetting people. But I think that you have a right to know, yeah? Sorry.
Yeah, well, we do mention it very briefly at the end of the report that is a piece of work that could be done, and that our schools super aware of the churches that they're attached to, and when assemblies and things are being delivered, what messages are being then introduced into schools, and are they aware of it? I mean, obviously you'll know my positioning on it, but the issue is about transparency. So if the vicar who was part of Reform that I ended up working with went into schools all the time, now had that been fully open and transparent, maybe things would be a lot different, but it's the fact that nobody really knows what messages are underlying things.
That's a good question here. Do we need a church equivalent of TripAdvisor where people can out churches? Yeah, that's such a good question, because again, like when you actually name a church, Oh my gosh, I get a lot of pushback on that
Yeah,
one.
absolutely. We do name churches, mostly if they do reasonably good messaging, to show that this can be done and it's not difficult. There used to be Ship of Fools. Did there used to be a thing? I don't know whether that still exists anymore. I don't know. I mean, what we've recommended in the report is that something like a Church Near You website becomes a hub for churches to signal their positions. And if people don't want to signal their positions, what does that tell you? You know, if a church can't say, look, we don't really dig the women priest thing, but come to our thing that we're doing. If they can't say that, then that tells us something about the symbolic violence that's been perpetrated. But so we suggest that maybe something like a Church Near You could act as a hub. But the outing thing, I'm up for that.
Sally, sorry. Which one? The inclusive church? Inclusive church.
Inclusive church, yes. Again, we talk about that in the report as being a kind of model for... There's a bit of a problem, if I may, because originally we were thinking, get churches who were really supportive and actually wanting to push back to signal their safe space, really. There is a problem because it normalises the fact that there are other churches that do this other thing. And really, all churches, as was our message, was all churches should be safe and okay for everybody. But inclusive church we've mentioned as a model for being proud of not being uncool theologically. I'm very well trained, you know, in my...
Sort of a final comment here, which is about, you know, how important it is to think about discrimination of all people in our church. And, you know, I've talked about treating, you know, God giving us a vision of a church where women and men are treated equally. But I mean, we might say a church, the vision is church where all people are treated equally. And I do want to actually put that out there and say that, because, but the reason why today we're focused on that part of the vision, which is about women and men treating equally, not setting aside others. But the reason that it's so imperative to deal with this is that like 2/3 of the people in our church are women, identify as women, and we are a minoritized majority. As Bishop Rose says, we're being asked to accept being treated as second class, to just say, it doesn't really matter, yeah? Of course, all the discrimination, which, as I said before, diminishes us. Other people, for other reasons, are being diminished, and it's important that we speak up for them too. Really important. But we haven't even dealt with the discrimination that now seems to be completely normalized about 2/3 of the people who attend our churches. Any final
Very
comment?
finally, that's reminded me that some of our respondents were saying they were told, don't bring this up because it's now a secondary issue.
Yes.
Which is astounding given the absolute furore it caused in the early 90s when people wanted to leave over this secondary issue. You know, it's just not ethical and it's not honest. And that made that particular woman cry with fury at being told her subjectivity was a secondary issue now. So, let's not do that.
Thank you.